Welcome to the Conscious Corner. I've been obsessed with conscious my whole life. I'm not sure why. I don't know what it is. I don't know where it's going. I don't know where it's been, but we'll figure it out together. In today's episode, I want to deep dive into self-valueism. What is self-valueism? Well, it combines two big concepts. One, the self, and two, the philosophy of valueism. Let's start with the self. The self is a big philosophical mystery and has been for many, many years. Why? We don't easily know which region of the brain or how in our mental space the continuum of understanding who we are is embedded in us throughout our lives. There is an objective lens of me, which is the facts about me, my name, my address, characteristics like my height or my hair color. Beyond that, there is a subjectivity of self that we carry through in our lives. We don't have a choice. When I wake up, I know who I am. Even if I want to be somebody else or escape the self, I can't. I live in this shell of a body. I have the mind that I have. I have the brain functioning that I have. And throughout all that, it accumulates almost to this concept of me, my energy. And that's been formed through many conscious inferences, the past. Some of those I memorize in my memories and I can recall. Some I don't, but they still make up who I am. And that's my definition of the self. The conscious inferences that I've had throughout my life accumulate to this concept of me. And that's the same for everybody. Everybody has the subjective experience of life, and along with it, the self is there for the ride. And the premise of the argument today is that if we maximize the value we place on ourselves, and that goes to the core of how we feel about ourselves. And this, to me, is very understated. It's under-discussed. People talk about the self in philosophical terms, and they have been for millennia, but they don't necessarily talk about the affect or the feeling we have to that concept of self. And in my opinion, that's very, very important. How we see ourselves. Seeing ourselves is one of the interesting topics in philosophy. It's trying to combine the objective with the subjective. We need to have self-reflection, which is an objective task, almost stepping outside of who we are and looking in and trying to be objective about who we are. We have been gifted such a powerful tool to be able to reflect on our own actions, our own habits, our behaviors, what we said, how we thought, how we felt. This is phenomenal to me. This is amazing. Because it helps us course correct. We can start to make changes where we're not happy about who we are. We can start to act differently if we want, think differently, just see the world differently and grow, change in a direction that the mental ability gives us. And everybody experiences that self-reflection in a different way. Some people are very good at being objective. And is objective an absolute? No. There are no absolutes in this life. Unfortunately, as much comfort as we want to say that there's absolutes, there's not. And many philosophers will debate that there is, and that's fine. But everything in some ways of interpretation through consciousness and subjectivity is relative. Even how we see ourselves is an interpretation by ourselves. There's a circular dependency, almost a conflict of interest when you're trying to do self-reflection, because I'm not sure anybody can be purely objective. There's always going to be those feelings that get in the way when we're trying to have the rational thoughts, the objectivity about how we're going in life. I want to know, am I adding value in this world? Am I adding value to the people around me as I go through life? To me, that's an important question that I want to try and answer. And Aristotle was one of the first people to touch on this. What if it's about being a good person, not necessarily what I achieve or what I do? I should focus inwards. And Eastern philosophy talks a lot about this. Focus on who we are. I should focus on who I am in my self-reflection and try and get me into a good place. And this is where ethics comes into it. If I start to do the right things and become the right person, that's going to lead to a great life. What I'm saying in today's episode, another way to look at it, is self-valueism. Self-valueism would lead to having a great life. If the value we place on ourselves is high, and again, subjective of what high means, but I think if it's for everybody to figure out, then we take ourselves to every situation. One thing that's common in my life and your life, every single situation you have, whether it be a social group, whether it be a work, whether it be finding love, relationships, you take yourself. And so how you see yourself and the value you place on yourself is a direct reflection in those situations. There is an old saying that if you do what you've done, you're going to get what you got. And then what that means is if you take yourself in every situation and do exactly the same thing, this is predominantly about relationships. You may go through a series of relationships, and I've been there. I went through relationships and they fell apart. And they fell apart what seemingly was for different reasons. But underlyingly, I was doing the same thing. I was taking myself into those relationships, doing the same thing over, expecting a different result. Somebody once said that's a definition of insanity. If you do the same thing and accept different results, yeah, you're probably on some spectrum of craziness at that point, because what's changed, not you. And you start to see that that is about that value you place. And more importantly for myself and a group of us out there, I'll probably say most people actually. I don't like to generalize, but I think most psychologists these days believe in some sort of childhood developmental theory where what happens to us during the critical developmental period plays out for the rest of our lives. And when it comes to self-valueism, yes, as we're learning the concept of self, when we're children, we start to build this concept. And it's very difficult, as they say, through teenage period, because you start to question or your social group. And as you start to understand the world, you start to understand yourself. And the influences that other people can have is very, very high at that time, because you're very heightened and sensitive to how other people see you. You start to understand the concept of social and maybe how social media these days represents value. You start to see, back then it was maybe magazines or TV. You start to understand the concept of value in terms of people and how it reflects on you. And as you start to build the core of self, you're starting to feel something about who you are. You're starting to place that value. And as you grow into adulthood, that value is almost your starting point of the self that you adjust throughout your lifespan. And there's both ends of the value spectrum here. Some people end up undervaluing or underrepresenting themselves, and how they feel is a negative. Not good enough is a classic example, is probably the most predominant undervaluing of self. The other end of the spectrum is ego. We all have bumped into people that have a lot of ego, super ego. And that's our opinion, though. The opinion of themselves is that they just place their value highly, very highly relative to what we think. And so it's interesting for us, and I don't want to be judgmental. I'm not judging those people. It's just that they've placed their value somewhere else than I would. But again, it's relative. I'm outside looking in. I think the most important thing there is they're not making value adjustments. If they go into situations and they've placed their value well above what their relative surrounding, whether it's work or family or social group, eventually what tends to happen is the people around them start to see that. And because of that value mismatch, it causes challenges over time. The same applies to what we just talked about. If you undervalue yourself, which I've experienced this, and think that you're not good enough or you're not deserving of the situation you're in. And that's when it comes down to a lot that happens earlier on in our lives, but then as we go through our 20s and 30s, this changes. At some point, a group of us start to realize there's something is wrong here. And that cognitive dissonance, which is you believe something. And a lot of what we're talking about is quote unquote the unconscious, which we've covered before, right? You don't normally walk around knowing that you're feeling undervalued to yourself. You just sort of, it's there like the self is, and you're in situations where the reward system you have doesn't fire as it should. And why is it tied to the reward system? Well, where is value happening? It's as you are executing day to day and going through life, you are doing things and sort of mini self-reflecting all the time. Like you walk out, let's say, of a meeting at work, you probably thought about how it went. It was a good example. Now, it could have gone very well. It could have gone poorly. You could think it went poorly where it didn't go as bad as you think it did. And that's mostly the common case. if you underrepresent your value, what you're going to do is be harsh on yourself. And you're going to be saying like, well, I'm no good. Of course I didn't do well. Of course that meeting didn't do well. But when you ask someone else, they're like, yeah, it wasn't too bad. So there is that interesting interplay with valueism where other people see the value you're providing. And this is why valueism as a philosophy is super important. It underpins the humanity we have as humans. How we interact with each other, especially either socially or relationships, is all about a value exchange. What we do in life is about value. We take value. We talked about internal value. This is more what we portray externally, and going to our jobs or our careers or our relationships. We taking ourselves in some ways and we're providing value to somebody else. A relationship's a great example. When you get into a relationship, there is naturally a value exchange. You're spending time together, but you're exchanging value. You're making that other person feel good. It might be through their love language or compliments, or either way, like just caring about that person in general is giving them value, that you're making them feel better. And over time, that value gets stronger and stronger, and you fall in love and you keep adding value and you get married. And then throughout the rest of your lives, living together and being an entity of marriage, then you're adding value to their life and you continue to add value. And what are you getting in exchange? Value from them. Your life is better because of them. Oftentimes, the strongest relationships is they're making me better. I feel better. I do better things when I'm around this person. And the heart of that is that value exchange. So going into trying to add value to somebody else's life, if they're the right person for you, they will reciprocate and you end up in a good spot. When we're talking about a job and a career, it's similar. Like the concept of valueism still holds. I go into work every day because I want to provide value to the company I work for. Hopefully that value is recognized, and over time, I get rewarded. I get rewarded either from subjective value, where they say, hey, you're doing a good job, or monetary value. We haven't talked about money, but money is an objective value of society. And so I want to add more and more value. The interesting thing about that type of value is I have to add value in the way that the company is expecting, because the company has expectations of my role and it's clearly defined for me. I can read about my expectations, and that's what I need to provide value. I bring my own flavor subjectively because we are human, right? When robots uprise, they're going to be very objective about the value they add. For now, we are human, so we take our subjectiveness into the situation. But what's interesting about that example is that self-valueism plays a role. And that the same example and how I see myself helps me. If I take in self-valueism to these situations, it increases the chance that I can add value externally to the company, to my role. And I've experienced this. If you're down on yourself and you're harsh on yourself and tell yourself you're not good enough, the chances of you going and performing at your best is probably slim. And so you start to see valueism is the core of what we do as humans, and the things that we exchange as we go through life in many different places is that value. And I'm trying to emphasize how important then taking a good self-value is into those situations. Same as a relationship or the job that I just talked about. If I don't feel good about myself, the chances are I'm going to struggle in certain situations where I have to add value or perform at my best. And so let's start talking about what makes good self-value. Leaving it as just as relative doesn't help, right? Just figure out. No, I think we have to start to provide some guides as to what the maximizing value means. We've all heard the term self-actualization, self-realization. Self-realization, we'll start there, is understanding who we are. And a next step, and a lot of philosophers have talked about this, is accepting who we are. What's interesting about life is we don't necessarily opt into our situation. And what I mean by that is that I didn't sign any contract or consent to be born. It sounds weird, and there's a whole group of philosophy around this, but the circumstances which I'm born, and even I would claim my childhood, I didn't have a lot of control over. Rightly so. I was a kid, and the whole goal is that I'm there to learn and develop and how to be a human being, let's say a fully fledged adult. So, like, I don't have the prefrontal cortex to start making life decisions, and I need help and guidance, and that's where the parents and the people around me and around everybody guide us through getting to adulthood. And even that's when really I felt more of the autonomy about my life. But a key part of that is accepting who I am as a person, as a human, and it doesn't mean that I don't want to grow and change. And that's the key. I think it takes time to get to self-realization, because going back to what we talked about, when we do self-reflection, there's certain things we don't like about ourselves. And this is such a natural human trait, especially when it comes physically. Right? I think everybody as humans don't like something, even what society sees as beautiful. Those people don't like something about themselves, probably. I'm going to guess. Like, there's always something we have, is what I'm trying to say, physically. And then add on top of that all of these emotions we have. And emotions are strong. Let's not beat around the bush. Emotions are strong and they overtake us, and sometimes we feel them so strongly it's hard to get away from those. And sometimes you don't want to get away from those. Embracing emotions is something we learn to do. But it doesn't make the feelings any less. If we're feeling sad and we're not happy, that feeling is super strong. It's an indicator if something isn't where we want it to be. So even before we get to some kind of self-realization, that's more the longer term play. Day to day, it's processing who we are, feeling that self-value, understanding the feelings we have towards ourselves, and determining if we want to change. And it's perfectly okay not to want to change. Maybe you're in a great place in life and everything is great, but I rarely bump into humans where they can say that. And then you ask general population, are you happy? There's a group of people who say absolutely yes, and maybe they've figured out how to be happy. There's a group of people that probably aren't happy, but they don't know why. And there's a group of people that know why they're unhappy, but not sure what to do about it. So what I'm trying to say is there's a vast variance of how humans go through life and how they feel. And we've just thrown in happiness casually, but utilitarianism these days is the predominant school of thought. Everybody wants to be happy, want to live a good life, you want to be happy, you want to have good things, you want to have nice things, you want to have good people around you. That is predominantly, I would say, what we are searching for. And so what I'm throwing in the mix is self-values. I mean, another way to look at how to live a good life, how to be happy. Get the way that you see yourself and the value you place on yourself in some kind of good shape. And this is akin to if you want to get stronger and physically feel fitter every day, you got to work on it. The mind is a muscle. You are working on your mind every day. You just don't know it. If you're consciously working on your mind and trying to improve and trying to help it grow, it will adapt. The whole premise of going and exercising is adaptation. Putting some sort of stress on your body, it responds by adapting and getting stronger and bigger and fitter and all of that stuff. It's the same with the brain. If you exercise it daily in terms of thinking about your reflection and your growth and how you can change and improve, it does get stronger over time. Does the self-valueism improve? Absolutely. You can change the way you see yourself, and more importantly, you can change the way you feel about yourself. And if you start to build that self-valueism and that confidence around who you are, it's the first step to self-actualization. Self-realization is a good acceptance of where we are, where we were, who we are, our attributes, our traits, our genetic disposition, our characteristics. You just do that self-realization. They talk about the next step, and by they, I mean many philosophers have talked about this, self-actualization. That's becoming the best version you can be, working towards that goalpost. And self-valueism is that as you go through life, you are seeing yourself differently. You're adding more and more value to yourself, working on yourself. Being the best version of yourself is maximizing that self-valueism. And while that's not easy to achieve, there are great benefits and results. And dare I say it, you're on the verge of then self-love. Like, you love who you are, which is probably one of the, I would say, most difficult things you could do in your life. Humans have a tendency to criticize ourselves, to be harsh with ourselves, to not like us. It's a tendency. I think getting through that and starting to see yourself in a better light. And you get a lot of data points about this. I don't want to underestimate how much externally influences how you see yourself, especially when you're younger, but even as adulthood. And these days with social media, we can start to form an image of who we should be or how we should act or how we should feel based on so many external influences. Whether that's the media, social media, and more importantly, our social group, the people that we hang around with regularly that portray the value from them, remember the self-valueism and the value we portray out, does have a direct influence on how we see ourselves. And sometimes it's unconscious. There was an old saying that we become the sum of the consciousness of our peers. They said Albert Einstein said this quote. I don't think he did, but it doesn't make it any less true. The people that we hang around heavily influence the self-value we have. If they're uplifting, if they're helping you and adding value to you, that will be very, very, very good. And it helps you to start to build self-value. If they're not, if they're being negative, not even towards you, but just in general, if they're being negative about life, that it's something that is, let's say, going to be hard for you and that you don't have any like real good chances of making it or succeeding, it starts to wear on you. It starts to become something you believe. You have to be very careful about how we form beliefs. They've always said you should surround yourself with the type of people you want to become, the one that's pushing you, that's uplifting you, and that's absolutely true. The brain will start to detect that kind of energy. The brain would see the value that they're trying to provide to you, and that's what it'll start to embed as the self-value. So be very careful, these influences. And even as we go through social media, and I scroll Instagram Reels, I'll say it now. It's a very interesting thing to do because I see so many different diverse people posting different things. I can start broadening my horizons about how people are living, but that will have an influence on me. Absolutely. The algorithms are designed to show you what you spend most time on, and so it's a reinforcement policy. You'll start to see reels that you are starting to gravitate towards, and that can have an influence. You start to see people live these lives that seem to be, wonderful and luxurious, and they've got everything figured out, and they're just having the best time. And then you can start to, when you put the phone down, you start thinking, well, why don't I have that, or why don't I feel that way? More importantly. And then you start feeling down. And if you're watching negative stuff, guess what? You're going to be in a negative space. If you see uplifting things and positive, that's going to reflect. A lot of what we talked about, we didn't talk about the neuroscience behind it. But there's a brain chemistry around dopamine release and certain areas of the brain, especially around the prefrontal cortex, that is exactly how we see ourselves. The medial and orbital prefrontal cortex, the ventral tangential area, the nucleus accumbens is the reward system. What is self and self-value? It's rewards over time. If you reward yourself in the right way and dopamine fires at the particular time, and it's the right type of reward, we talked about the objectiveness, it has to be the right type, then over time you will start to build your reward system into some kind of self-value. So we didn't want to go too deep in the neuroscience behind it, but what I'm trying to say is that is easily influenced. When you see things, when you hear things, just be careful of the energy you're taking in because it does matter. Let's just wrap up today's discussions with, I hope everybody's self-valueism ends up in a really, really good place.